We're pleased to have Professor Srinivas with us this afternoon. He came to Cambridge from the University of Mysore for this term to give the Fraser Lecture, and we thought we would take the opportunity of his presence here of getting him to talk a little about his own career in social anthropology, both in relationship to the people he met and in relationship to the problems with which he himself dealt, and particularly perhaps saying how much social anthropology had changed or not changed in India during the years he had been associated with it. I first met Professor Srinivas at Oxford in the distant past, but before that he had been a student at Bombay, so perhaps I might ask you to begin in that ambiance.
I went to Bombay in the 30s from Mysore because my teachers in Mysore had advised me that the best sociologist in India was then teaching in Bombay, and he was Ghurye. And Ghurye, incidentally, was perhaps one of the last students of Rivers in Cambridge. I went to Ghurye, very raw and immature and perhaps opinionated young man, and I told Ghurye, I think, that I wanted to write 2 volumes on Indian sociology. He smiled and said, "You will do that." And then he asked me to do a dissertation on marriage and family among the Kannada castes in Mysore. I think he found me too much out of touch with facts, and he wanted to teach me some respect for facts. And I did this dissertation largely out of gazetteers and volumes on tribes and castes, eked out with some field work. And the fieldwork portion was quite interesting. It was even exciting, as I remember now. And I got my master's, and then I proceeded to do a PhD on the Kurgs of South India with Ghurye. This was a thesis based on field work, and Kurg in those days, this was during World War II, in those days was still somewhat cut off. We had buses from Mysore to the capital Maikera and beyond, but Kurg was quite a wild country in those days, and with very few restaurants or hotels, and I had to stay in the homes of friends to do my field work. And as it happened, I came down with some very severe stomach trouble, and this destroyed any notions I had of staying in a Kurg village and seeing everything for myself. So after I had been treated for my stomach trouble, I used to pay visits to Markera, and from there go to the interior, witness ceremonies and visit temples, talk to people, and this was how the material was gathered. I spent several weeks in Markera, and I was lucky enough to came across a very learned and also very well informed Kurg who taught me about the language, the customs, beliefs, etc. And he also helped me translate some of the Kurg folklore I had collected. And the result of my efforts was a somewhat heavy thesis, about 900 pages if I remember rightly, and I submitted it to the University of Bombay in 1944, and I think I didn't collect my degree. I got it in 45, sometime in 45. And from Bombay I came to Oxford on the recommendation of Gurrier, who told me that unlike Malinowski, Ratley Brown was a seeded functionalist. And it is interesting because Ratley Brown was, I think, the first student of Rivers at Cambridge.
Mm-hmm.
So I came to Oxford in May 1945, and Ratley Brown had returned a few months previously from a rather extended stay in Sao Paulo in Brazil. And the subject of my PhD dissertation was not approved by him. I had chosen as the subject of my dissertation an examination of the concept of patterns of culture by Ruth Benedict, taking material from 3 South Indian tribes or marginal groups, two of them being Todas and Chenchus, I think. I'm not sure about the second. And the third one being, of course, my Kurgs. Ratley Brown did not like Ruth Benedict's approach, thought her highly unscientific, but I wanted to stick up for my choice of theme. I think he was very patient with me, and before he went for the summer vacation, he said, if you want to work on patterns of culture, write me a long paper on it during the long vacation, and then we shall decide during the coming Michaelmas term. I worked quite hard during that summer vacation and produced a paper of sorts, and I gave it to Ratley Brown to read. A few days afterwards, he returned the paper to me and said, it's all right, you can go on and work on patterns of culture. I had won my point, but I could see that he was not very happy about it. I then asked him, look, what exactly do you think about my theme? Do you think it's useful for me to work on it now that I've been given the permission by you to work on it? What do you think of it? He said, I remember the words, it's a waste of time for a man of your talents to spend any time on Ruth Benedict. And I said, what shall I do then? Then I had forgotten the fact that I had burdened the poor man with these 2 volumes of mine to take home with him to Wales for the summer vacation. He said, I've just been looking at your Cook thesis. Did you go to an English school? I said, no, I went to a neighborhood school. Then he said something very highly complimentary about my written English and said, there is wonderful material here. Why don't you look at this material from the functionalist point of view? I said, look, I do not have the funds to make another field trip to Cook. It will be very expensive and it's beyond my means. He said, you need go to Cook. There's plenty of material here. Why don't you look at it? You can register yourself for a PhD. So I registered for myself for a PhD with the title, The Social Function of Religion in a South Indian Community. South Indian Community. And that is how the Kurg book came to be written. Of course, R.B. insisted that I read, very rightly, Fustel de Coulanges. He was a great admirer of Fustel de Coulanges. What is that book?
The Ancient City?
Ancient City, Durkheim and Bateson. and then of course EP's Azande volume and the Nua. I read, of course, R.B.'s own writings, The Andaman Islanders, and so on. And I really worked hard. I looked at my data from the functionalist point of view, and suddenly it started falling in place. I may add here that Gurye was still committed to Rivers's ideas in his last phase. I think Rivers in 1922 had formed a kind of triumvirate with Perry and Elliott Smith, and they were diffusionists of a very wild sort, saying that human creativity is limited, and all the good ideas, or some of the best ideas, did occur in ancient Egypt, and then they traveled to the rest of the world. And I wrote my Kurg book under this unfortunate theoretical framework, if I may call it that. And I discovered, or rather I was extremely dissatisfied with the result of my efforts. Ultimately, it came to where did the Kurgs come from, you see. Some people had brought them in from the Gulf countries, as they are called now. Some others had brought them in from Central Asia. And the Kurgs themselves, they knew about both these hypotheses, and one knowledgeable Kurg would favor the Gulf states, another Central Asia, you see. I think both of them based on an equal measure of ignorance. I looked for some physical anthropological data, and all that I know about them is that they have extreme brachycephalism amongst them, you see. And this, I think, posed a problem to the people who were swearing that they were Aryans. And I turned to Haddon's Races of Mankind, or Races of Man, I think there's a book called that. And I found Haddon had introduced a second migration of Aryans in the second edition of his Races of Man, without informing that it was a new edition, you see. I'm mentioning all this because this kind of diffusionism was a guessing game, and I was fed up with it, you see. I told myself, I'll go to Oxford. If I can't do any, if I can't get to a sociology which is more definitive, then I'm going to quit the field and do something else, you see. And R.B.'s functionalism came to me really, was extremely helpful. And looking at the Kurg material from a Durkheimian and R.B. point of view, I found it made a lot of sense to me, you see. At last, I had come to a sociology which was on the one hand related to empirical data, on the other hand it produced some theoretical insights into Indian culture and society. I felt I had come home, and this is why I feel that nowadays Ratley Brown's reputation is not very high, particularly in England. I think people do not know the kind of importance his ideas had at the time he came on the scene. He came on the scene when Rivers, who was then extremely influential, along with Grafton, Elliott Smith and Perry, had embraced this wild functionalism. And I think R.B. on the one hand and Malinowski on the other were a welcome corrective.
Mm-hmm.
You want me to go on?
Yes. But Gurye, he wasn't influenced at all by Rivers' other interests, because Rivers, of course, was not only interested in diffusionism. His book on social organization was a very interesting analytical volume, which, in a sense, influenced, frankly, Brown himself there.
On that, there are 2 points I'd like to make. One is that it was Gurye who made me read his copy of Kinship and Social Organization.
It was, yes, yes.
There were a few lectures meant to be given at Calcutta or somewhere. You see. Anyway, I read them. And
Yes.
Gurye himself was deeply interested in the field of kinship, an interest which he pursued for a long time. And he has written a paper on dual organization in India. This interest was there. I think about social, what is the other book? Social organization? Yeah, isn't that?
Yes.
Social organization, he was a bit more, bit less enthusiastic, let me put it that way. Arby, on the other hand, was quite enthusiastic about social organization. He told me that he could point to passages in social organization which Rivers had rewritten to answer criticisms by Arby. So Arby...
You mean Rivers had given the manuscript to Radcliffe Brown
yeah,
to read?
Yeah, and Radcliffe Brown was convinced that had Rivers lived longer, he would have seen the light and been converted to Arby and Durkheimian functionalism. It's a very interesting thing. And social organization, I think Rivers comes closest to being a sociologist, I would say. And it was obvious that to me that Arby had been in touch with Rivers. As to the extent of the influence Arby wielded on Rivers in his last phase, this is a matter for research.
Did Gurye dominate Indian anthropology at that time?
Oh, actually, Gurye, I would say, is probably the single most important influence in Indian sociology and anthropology. And one of the good things in India is you can be a sociologist and do anthropological work, and you can be a social anthropologist and do sociological work. And this is one of the main factors in it is the influence of Gurye, because Gurye he could write on the disposal of the human placenta in India. That was one of his interests. And then Indo-European kinship on the other. And he could also write about cities, about sadhus, about caste and race in India. So he was kind of what is the word for it? The word polymath.
Yeah.
And his basic training had been in Sanskrit. He got his master's in Sanskrit, and Bombay then had a very good tradition in Sanskrit learning and teaching. And I think Gurye got the Chancellor's Medal. And then he came under the influence of Patrick Geddes, who was appointed in 1914 as the director of the School of Economics and Sociology in Bombay. For some odd reason, he was brought in and given charge of a research institution with not emphasis on day-to-day teaching. And this was one of the best things that happened in the social sciences in India. Gurye, after a year with Geddes, he went to Hobhouse in London and found Hobhouse monumentally dull. So he left him after 6 months, I think 6 months or a year, and then came to Cambridge, where he came under the influence of Rivers and Haddon. And then, he was completely overwhelmed by Rivers's personality. And he told me that after meeting Rivers, he was walking along maybe Trinity Street, and he saw a copy of Rivers's latest publication, Instinct in the Unconscious. And then he read it, and he told Rivers he had read it, and he asked Gurye what he thought of it. Gurye said, "It's very good, but it is mechanistic," which I thought was very, you need a lot of, spunk to tell a man like Rivers that your book is mechanistic, when you have just come from India and so on. Apparently this made Rivers like Gurye, and he allowed Gurye to submit a couple of papers, long papers for his PhD. And Gurye told me that one of the one of the disasters in his life was to see St. John's flag flying half-mast one morning, and Rivers had died suddenly on the operating table of strangulated hernia, and Rivers felt orphaned, as he told me. But apparently Rivers had spoken to Haddon about Gurye, and Gurye finished his thesis and got back to Bombay to the, as it then was, the School of Economics and Sociology. And subsequently, though he himself was an armchair sociologist, he built up a sociological tradition based on fieldwork. He knew that India had started to change in a big way, and he would get his students to, on the one hand, to dig up data from tribes and castes, reports, gazetteers, travelers' accounts, etc., etc., and on the other to do field work. But I think I was probably one of the students, I was probably one of those whom he wanted to go in for intensive field work. I remember receiving a letter from him in the field when I told him that I had gathered, I think I was given to bragging. I said I had gathered a tremendous amount of data. He wrote me back promptly saying, remember Malinowski, you see. I think it was a gentle but a very firm snub, and it taught me the virtues of modesty, I think. Anyway, I think I have done with Gurye, and Gurye said that Rattler Brown was the person I should go to. I think he found Malinowski. He didn't like Malinowski, partly because Malinowski was so critical of Rivers, I think, whereas Rattler Brown had been, it is the, this kind of bond is recognized in Indian learning. If you are the student of the same teacher, you are called Guru Bhai, that is brothers
in the same guru.
Guru.
Yes, yes.
So he recommended me to his Guru Bhai.
Yes.
And then Abi left Oxford in, what was it, 46 July. And then he recommended me to EP. He told EP that he should take me on. And it was under EP I finished my thesis on the Kurgs. And EP threw a lot of cold water on Durkheim. I think EP thought that I was too enthusiastic in my embrace of functionalism. And he wanted to gently introduce some skepticism into my frame of mind, which I think he did succeed over a longer period of time. But I found that EP poo-pooed Durkheim, but if you read his Newer Religion and see his chapter on Newer Sacrifice, he takes a tremendous amount from Durkheim. I think EP at that phase in his life was rejecting Durkheim because of his determinism, but it did not mean that he rejected the sounder portions in Durkheim's sociology. Anyway, to cut a long story short, I got my degree in July 47, and EP was present at when I was conferred the degree, because I was his first PhD baby in Oxford. So I have I was in essence the last student of RB in Oxford and the first of EP. And it was EP who created the job for me in Oxford as university lecturer in Indian sociology. And one of the attractions of the job was, I got this letter when I was in India. He gave the first year of my job, he told me that I could spend a year doing field work in an Indian village, because I had told him that I felt very keenly the lack of really intensive field work, the lack of experience of really intensive field work. And he said, why don't you do it while you are there instead of coming here and then going back after a year? So I was delighted with this offer, and it is really it illustrates how thoughtful EP could be when it came to action, when it came to helping a younger colleague, student. And I regard my 10.5 months in Rampura as probably one of the most important periods in my life, because I did do fairly serious, intensive field work, and my whole knowledge of India, in a sense, underwent a change as a result of this experience. It is because of that that I am an ardent advocate of experience of intensive field work, whether one is doing social anthropology or sociology in India. And this is particularly necessary for Indians, because by and large the kind of students who come into higher learning in India, whether it's social anthropology or physics, come from the urban middle classes and upper castes, and they have very little knowledge of India. In fact, very little knowledge, except in the case of some students coming from traditional groups, very little knowledge of their traditional culture, and still less of rural areas. And finally, living in a caste-cum-class society, you unconsciously imbibe certain negative attitude towards the culture of lower groups. And one way of getting all this negative stuff out of them is to send them to a village or tribe or urban slum. And I don't know if any of you have seen a book which I edited along with two of my colleagues 2 years ago, The Field Worker in the Field. It consists of 18 statements of intensive field experiences in different settings. 16 of them are based on Indian experience, and they include not only working in village India and tribal India, but also urban slums, factories, trade unions, politics in small town politics, an Ari Samaj neighborhood unit, the range and diversity of the experience, going into a matrilineal area in a very traditional part of Palghat in southern Kerala. So the range of experience is astonishing, and I would make it compulsory reading for anybody taking up social anthropology or sociology, not because I'm one of its editors, but I do think that Indian students particularly need to be brought out of their domestic and caste and sectarian shells to appreciate this richness and diversity of Indian culture, and also much more important to see that multiplicity of perceptions is basic to Indian society and culture. I don't know if I'm making sense to you, but
how have you